There are moments in life when being told no feels like an insult. Jake Morrison experienced one of those moments in March 2015, standing in a Massey Ferguson dealership in central Kansas, staring at a salesman who just refused to sell him the tractor he wanted. Jake was 28 years old, newly married, running 2,200 acres of wheat and milo on land his family had farmed since the 1950s. He'd walked into that dealership with a clear goal: buy the biggest, most powerful Massey Ferguson they had, prove to his neighbors and his doubting father-in-law that he was serious about building something, and establish himself as a farmer who ran first-class equipment. The salesman, a 62-year-old man named Ed Garrison who'd been selling tractors since before Jake was born, had listened to Jake's pitch, asked a dozen questions about his operation, and then said something that made Jake's face go red. "I'm not selling you that tractor. You don't need it, and it'll put you out of business within 3 years." Jake thought Ed was insulting his intelligence. What he didn't realize, standing there furious and embarrassed, was that Ed had just made a decision that would save Jake's farm, his marriage, and possibly his life. But that realization wouldn't come for 5 years, and the education Jake received in the meantime would be brutal, humbling, and ultimately the most valuable thing he'd ever learn about the difference between what you want and what will keep you alive. This is the story of a young farmer who walked into a dealership looking for validation, a salesman who risked a commission to prevent a disaster, and a Massey Ferguson tractor that became the machine Jake resented for years before understanding it was the only reason he survived. It's about ego meeting experience, the gap between horsepower and wisdom, and what happens when someone who knows better refuses to let you make a mistake, even when you're begging them to take your money. Jake Morrison thought Ed Garrison sold him the wrong tractor. What Ed actually did was see 5 years into the future, recognize a financial catastrophe forming, and refuse to be part of it even if it cost him the sale. The Massey Ferguson 7616 that Jake drove off the lot that day wasn't the machine he wanted, but it was exactly the machine that would still be running when half his neighbors' farms went under. And the man Jake thought had disrespected him turned out to be the only person in the room who actually cared whether Jake was still farming in 2020. Jake had grown up on his family's farm, the youngest of 3 sons, working alongside his father and older brothers from the time he could reach a clutch pedal. His father, Robert Morrison, was old school, a man who ran paid-off equipment, avoided debt like it carried disease, and measured success not by acreage or horsepower, but by whether you could survive a bad year without losing ground. Jake's older brothers had followed that philosophy. They farmed conservatively, expanded slowly, and ran machinery that was functional but never flashy. Jake respected his father, but he didn't want to farm the way his father had farmed. He'd gone to college, studied ag business, read all the modern farming publications that preached efficiency, scale, and leveraging equity to grow. When Jake married Emily in 2013, her father, a successful businessman from Wichita who knew nothing about farming but everything about spreadsheets, had looked at the Morrison family operation and called it small time. That comment sat in Jake's chest like a stone. He was determined to prove that he could build something bigger, more impressive, more modern than what his father had settled for. By 2015, Jake had taken over a portion of the family operation and was farming independently, leasing additional ground and making his own equipment decisions. Commodity prices were strong. Wheat was over $6 a bushel. The farming economy felt bulletproof. Everywhere Jake looked, he saw neighbors buying new equipment, expanding acreage, building shop buildings with their names on them. The pressure to keep up, to look successful, to prove he belonged in that tier of farmers who ran the best iron and the biggest operations, was constant. Jake's father had warned him about that pressure. He'd said the same thing Ed Garrison would eventually say, that equipment doesn't make you a farmer, and debt will kill you faster than drought. But Jake was 28 and hungry and tired of being cautious. When his old tractor, a 15-year-old machine with 6,000 hours that still ran fine, started needing minor repairs, Jake saw an opportunity. He could trade up. He could get into something powerful, something new, something that would make a statement. He started researching Massey Ferguson's high-horsepower lineup, and the machine that caught his attention was the 8670, a 270-horsepower beast that could pull anything and came loaded with every feature the modern farming magazines said you needed. In March, Jake drove to Ed Garrison's dealership, a family-owned Massey Ferguson operation that had been serving the county since 1972. Ed had sold Jake's father multiple tractors over the years, always honest, never pushy, the kind of dealer who showed up personally when something broke and didn't leave until it was fixed. But Jake wasn't interested in relationship history that day. He wanted horsepower and respect. He walked into Ed's office and told him exactly what he wanted. The Massey Ferguson 8670, fully loaded, with the best financing terms Ed could offer. Ed didn't reach for a calculator. He didn't smile and start talking payments. He leaned back in his chair, looked at Jake for a long moment, and asked a question that caught Jake off guard. "Why do you need 270 horsepower?" Jake explained his operation, the acreage, the soil types, the implement sizes. Ed listened without interrupting. Then he asked more questions. "What's your current debt load? What are your operating margins? How many bad years can you survive if commodity prices drop?" Jake answered, increasingly frustrated, feeling like he was being interrogated instead of helped. When he finished, Ed stood up, walked to the window, and said something Jake would never forget. "I'm not selling you that tractor. It'll bankrupt you." The words hit Jake like a slap. He felt his face flush. He demanded to know what Ed meant, why Ed thought he had the right to tell a customer what they could or couldn't buy. Ed turned around, calm as Sunday morning, and explained. The 8670 would cost Jake $300 after his trade-in. The monthly payment, even with good financing, would be around $5,200 for 7 years. Ed had looked at Jake's operation details, run the numbers in his head, and knew that payment was unsustainable. Jake's acreage didn't justify that much horsepower. His implement lineup didn't require it. And most importantly, if commodity prices dropped even 20%, Jake wouldn't be able to cover that payment and his operating costs simultaneously. Ed had seen this story 100 times over 40 years. A young farmer, ambitious and capable, convinces himself he needs the biggest machine to prove something and takes on a payment that looks manageable during good years, then gets crushed when the market turns. Ed had sold tractors to farmers who'd lost everything because they'd bought based on ego instead of need. He wasn't going to do it again, not to Jake, not to Robert Morrison's son. Jake was furious. He accused Ed of being condescending, of underestimating his operation, of treating him like a kid who didn't understand farming. Ed didn't get defensive. He just asked Jake one more question. "If wheat drops to $4 a bushel next year, can you still make that $5,200 payment every month and cover your inputs?" Jake opened his mouth to say yes, then stopped. He'd run those numbers at home. The answer was no. At $4 a bushel, his margins would collapse, and a $5,200 tractor payment would consume cash he'd need for seed and fertilizer. But admitting that felt like admitting failure, like proving Ed right and Jake wrong. So Jake changed tactics. He asked what Ed thought he should buy instead, the sarcasm thick in his voice, expecting Ed to point him towards some cheap, underpowered compromise. Ed walked Jake out to the lot and showed him a Massey Ferguson 7616, a 160-horsepower tractor, clean and capable, but nowhere near the size or power of the 8670. Ed explained that this machine would handle everything Jake's operation actually needed, pull his planter and drill without complaint, cost half what the 8670 cost, and carry a monthly payment around $2,800. Jake looked at that tractor and felt insulted. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't impressive. It was the kind of machine his father would buy, cautious and boring and safe. Jake told Ed he'd think about it, walked out to his truck, and sat there fuming. For 2 weeks, Jake shopped around. He called other dealerships, looking for someone who'd sell him the 8670 without the lecture. He found a dealer 60 miles south, a high-volume operation that moved equipment like a grocery store, and the salesman there didn't ask questions. He just ran the numbers, offered financing, and had paperwork ready to sign. Jake was ready to do it, ready to prove Ed wrong, ready to buy the tractor he wanted from someone who respected him enough not to argue. Then he made the mistake of telling Emily what he was doing. Emily, who'd been raised by a businessman father who'd built his success on calculated risk, asked Jake the same question Ed had asked. What happens if prices drop? Jake tried to explain that prices weren't going to drop, that the market was strong, that this was the right time to expand. Emily pulled up commodity price history on her laptop and showed Jake what wheat had done in 2008, dropping from $8 to $4.50 in 6 months. She asked him again, what happens to us if that happens again while you're carrying a $200 payment? Jake didn't have an answer. That night, lying awake in bed, he realized Ed hadn't been insulting him. Ed had been trying to protect him from himself. Jake went back to Ed's dealership the next morning. He didn't apologize. His pride wouldn't let him, but he told Ed he'd reconsidered and wanted to talk about the 7616. Ed didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just pulled out the paperwork, ran the numbers honestly, and explained exactly what Jake was getting. The 7616 wasn't the biggest tractor Massey Ferguson made, but it was built on the same engineering principles, the same transmission reliability, the same hydraulic efficiency. It had enough horsepower for Jake's acreage and implement sizes without waste. The fuel efficiency was better, the maintenance costs were lower, and the payment, $2,850 a month at 4.2% interest over 6 years, was something Jake could survive even in a bad market. Ed also did something unusual. He showed Jake the dealer cost on both tractors, the actual invoice numbers, so Jake could see that Ed wasn't pushing the cheaper machine to protect his margin. Ed made less commission on the 7616, but he slept better at night, knowing the farmers he sold to would still be farming in 5 years. Jake signed the papers that afternoon. When the Massey Ferguson 7616 was delivered to his farm a week later, Jake's father walked around it, kicked the tires, and nodded. "Good choice," he said. Jake didn't tell him Ed had made the choice for him. The first season with the 716 was humbling. The tractor worked flawlessly, pulled everything Jake needed it to pull, and sipped fuel compared to what the 8670 would have burned. But it wasn't impressive. When Jake showed up to plant his wheat that spring, his neighbor pulled into the adjacent field with a brand new 300 horsepower machine from a competing brand, a monster that made Jake's Massey Ferguson look like a toy. The neighbor waved, smiled, and made a comment about Jake running a cute little tractor. Jake felt the sting. He'd made the responsible choice, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like settling. At the co-op, other farmers talked about their new equipment, their horsepower numbers, their technology packages. Jake stayed quiet. He had nothing to brag about. The 7616 was just a tractor, doing its job, boring and reliable and completely unremarkable. Jake resented it. He resented Ed for talking him out of the machine he'd wanted. And every time he climbed into that cab, he felt like he was driving proof that he'd played it safe while everyone else was playing to win. But Jake ran his operation well. He kept his costs tight. He managed his inputs carefully. He didn't waste money on things that didn't directly contribute to yield. The 7616 never broke down, never threw a code, never left him stranded. By the end of 2015, Jake's margins were solid. Not spectacular, but healthy. His payment was manageable. His stress level was lower than he'd expected. Emily was happy because the household budget wasn't stretched to breaking. Jake's father, who rarely gave compliments, mentioned that Jake was farming smart. But Jake still thought about the 8670. He still wondered what it would have been like to run that much power, to command that kind of respect in the community. The question sat in the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. Had Ed saved him from a mistake, or had Ed just scared him into mediocrity? The answer started revealing itself in 2016. Wheat prices began sliding. By fall, they dropped from $6 to $4.70. Jake's revenue took a hit, but his payment structure held. The $2,850 he owed every month was painful, but it didn't break him. He covered his inputs, paid his bills, and stayed current. Then 2017 hit, and prices kept falling. By spring, wheat was trading at $4.15. Jake's margins evaporated. He was farming to break even, watching commodity reports every morning like they were sentencing hearings. The stress was crushing. But the payment on the 7616, which had seemed so boring and conservative when he'd signed for it, suddenly felt like the only reason he wasn't drowning. Jake started hearing stories. Neighbors who'd bought big iron in 2014 and 2015 were struggling. Payment schedules that had seemed manageable at $6 wheat were becoming unsustainable at $4 wheat. Farmers started selling equipment at a loss, trying to get out from under payments before the banks forced the issue. Jake watched it happen in real time, saw good farmers make hard choices, and realized how close he'd come to being one of them. The neighbor who'd mocked Jake's cute little tractor in 2015 sold his 300-horsepower machine in 2017 for 60 cents on the dollar, taking a $90,000 loss just to eliminate a payment he couldn't afford anymore. The dealership that had been so eager to sell Jake the 8670 without asking questions went out of business in 2018, leaving their customers with no local service support and warranty claims that went nowhere. And Ed Garrison, the man who'd told Jake no when Jake wanted to hear yes, kept his dealership running, kept his customers farming, and never once mentioned that he'd been right. Jake started paying attention to which farmers were surviving the downturn and which ones were selling out. The pattern was obvious. The farmers who'd bought based on need instead of ego, who'd kept their payments manageable, who'd listened to people like Ed instead of their own pride, those were the ones still farming. The ones who'd leveraged themselves to the limit, chasing horsepower and image, were the ones loading equipment onto trailers and walking away from generational ground. By 2019, Jake's perspective had shifted completely. The 7616, which he'd resented for years, had become the foundation of his survival. It had never let him down. It had never cost him a harvest day. It had never buried him in repair bills. And most importantly, it had never demanded a payment he couldn't make. Jake's operation wasn't the biggest in the county. His equipment wasn't the flashiest, but he was still farming, still profitable, still building equity instead of bleeding it. His father-in-law, the businessman from Wichita who'd called the Morrison operation small time, had watched several of his corporate investments collapse during the agricultural downturn. Meanwhile, Jake was still standing, still working, still making payments on time. The respect Jake had been chasing in 2015 by buying the biggest tractor started coming to him in 2019 for a different reason. He was the young farmer who'd made it through the crash, and people started asking how. In December 2019, Jake drove to Ed's dealership. Not because he needed anything, not because the 7616 was having problems, but because he owed Ed a conversation. Ed was in his office, same desk, same calm demeanor, and when Jake walked in, Ed looked up and smiled. Jake sat down and said something he should have said 4 years earlier. "You were right. I didn't need the 8670. If I'd bought it, I'd be gone right now." Ed nodded, didn't make a big deal out of it, just acknowledged the comment with the quiet dignity of a man who'd heard similar confessions before. Jake asked Ed how he'd known, how he'd looked at Jake's operation and seen a disaster that Jake couldn't see himself. Ed's answer was simple. "I've been doing this for 40 years. I've sold tractors to farmers who succeeded and farmers who failed. The ones who failed always had one thing in common. They bought based on what they wanted to project instead of what they actually needed. You wanted that 8670 to prove something to your neighbors, to your father-in-law, maybe to yourself. But proving something doesn't pay bills. Doing the work pays bills. The 7616 does your work. That's all that matters." Jake asked if Ed had lost sales over the years by refusing to sell people what they wanted. Ed smiled. "All the time. But I've never lost sleep over it. I'd rather lose a sale than watch a farm go under because I helped someone make a bad decision." Jake realized in that moment that Ed hadn't been acting like a salesman in 2015. He'd been acting like a neighbor, like a mentor, like someone who cared more about Jake's survival than his own commission. That kind of integrity was rare in any business, but especially in equipment sales, where the pressure to move units and hit targets could override everything else. Ed had built his reputation on telling people no when they needed to hear it, even when it cost him money. And that reputation had kept his dealership alive when higher volume competitors had collapsed. The story of Ed's refusal to sell Jake the 8670 became something Jake told other young farmers, a cautionary tale about the difference between ego and wisdom. Jake kept running the 7016, maintained it religiously, and by 2020 it had over 3,000 hours on it and still ran like it was new. Commodity prices started recovering. Jake's operation stabilized. He paid off the 7616 in early 2021, 6 months ahead of schedule, and for the first time in his farming career, he owned his primary tractor outright. The feeling was better than any horsepower number could have provided. When Jake's father-in-law visited the farm that summer and saw the paid-off Massey Ferguson sitting in the shed, he asked Jake if he ever regretted not buying something bigger. Jake told him the truth. Every day for the first 3 years, not once in the last 2. In 2022, Jake was ready to expand. Commodity prices had recovered to sustainable levels. His operation was profitable. His debt was minimal. He went back to Ed's dealership, this time with Emily, and told Ed he was ready to add another tractor. Ed asked the same questions he'd asked in 2015, but this time Jake had better answers. His acreage had grown to 3,200. His implement lineup had expanded. He had the revenue to justify more horsepower. Ed walked him out to the lot and showed him a Massey Ferguson 8727, a 270 horsepower machine, the same class as the 8670 Jake had wanted 7 years earlier. Ed ran the numbers. With Jake's improved financial position, his paid-off equipment, and his proven track record of managing debt responsibly, the payment was sustainable. Ed looked Jake in the eye and said something that felt like a rite of passage. "Now you're ready for this." Jake bought the 8727 that afternoon. When it was delivered 2 weeks later, he kept the 7616 instead of trading it in. That tractor had saved his farm. It deserved to stay. The neighbor who'd sold his 300 horsepower machine at a loss in 2017 saw Jake's new Massey Ferguson and made a comment about Jake finally joining the big horsepower club. Jake just smiled. He didn't explain that he'd wanted to join that club 7 years earlier and that Ed Garrison had saved him from himself. He didn't mention that the reason he could afford the 8727 in 2022 was because he'd been forced to settle for the 7616 in 2015. Some lessons don't need to be explained. They just need to be lived. Jake had lived through the gap between wanting and needing, between ego and survival, between what impresses people and what actually works. And the education had been worth every moment of resentment he'd felt toward a tractor that refused to quit and a dealer who refused to let him fail. Ed Garrison retired in 2023, handing the dealership over to his son. But before he left, he did something unusual. He wrote letters to about 20 farmers, people he'd sold to over the decades, people he'd told no when they'd wanted to hear yes. Jake received one. It was short, handwritten, and said something Jake had framed and hung in his shop. A good dealer sells you what you need, not what you want. A great dealer knows the difference and has the guts to tell you the truth, even when it costs him. You didn't need the 8670 in 2015. You needed time, experience, and a tractor that wouldn't bury you. I'm proud you're still farming. That's the only commission that ever mattered. Jake read that letter 3 times the day it arrived, then called Ed to say thank you. Ed's response was classic. "You don't thank me. You thank that 7616. It's the one that showed up every day." The Massey Ferguson 7616 sits in Jake's shed, semi-retired now, used for light work and emergencies. It has over 5,000 hours on it and still starts on the first crank. Jake's son, born in 2016, learned to drive on that tractor, the same way Jake had learned on his father's equipment. When the kid asked why they kept an old tractor when they had newer machines, Jake told him the story. About walking into a dealership wanting one thing and being sold another. About a dealer who cared more about Jake's survival than his own profit. About a tractor that wasn't impressive, but was exactly right. The kid didn't fully understand, but he would someday. Every farmer eventually learns that the equipment that saves you isn't the equipment that impresses people. It's the equipment that's still running when everything else has failed. Jake Morrison had walked into Ed Garrison's dealership in 2015 looking for validation, respect, and a machine that would prove he belonged among the big operators. What Ed sold him instead was humility, sustainability, and a future. The Massey Ferguson 7616 wasn't the tractor Jake wanted. It was the tractor that kept him farming when half his neighbors couldn't. And the dealer who refused to sell Jake what he asked for turned out to be the only person in the room who actually understood what Jake needed. Some people sell you products. Some people save your life. Ed Garrison did both, and the machine sitting in Jake's shed, boring and reliable and still running strong, was the proof that sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is tell you no.